It began with a discovery that should have never seen the light of day. Deep within the Ozark Mountains, hidden by fog and silence, there existed a family that America itself tried to erase, a bloodline so corrupted, so inbred, that even time seemed unwilling to remember it. The files were buried in an old state archive, sealed for nearly a century, their contents marked simply as Undisclosed Family Case, 1934. When those records resurfaced, they revealed more than history. They exposed a secret that still haunts the mountains today. At the center of it all was a man known only as the Father, a self-proclaimed prophet who believed the outside world had been poisoned, that salvation could only be found in purity of blood. He took his daughters, his nieces, and eventually their children, binding them to his delusion of divine lineage. What began as isolation became ritual. What began as faith became horror. For years, travelers through the Ozarks whispered about strange things in those hills, voices that carried through the trees, figures watching from the fog, and laughter that didn't sound human. Locals would tell you the same thing. Stay away from the old ridge, that's where the family lived. But few ever did. The deeper you went, the quieter the forest became, as if even nature itself refused to breathe near that place. When the farmhouse was finally found, its windows blackened and doors sealed shut, the investigators expected abandonment. What they uncovered instead was a nightmare, carved into wood and bone. There were children's drawings on the walls, faces with no eyes, words scratched beneath them like prayers. A basement door bolted from the outside, and under the floorboards, jars, each one holding something that should never have been kept. The family was gone, but their story wasn't. The evidence suggested they didn't die. They were hidden. Some of their descendants were rumored to have slipped quietly into nearby towns, changing names, blending in, their lineage diluted but not destroyed. Yet every few decades, reports surface again, children born in remote cabins with features that can't be explained, and voices whispering through the mountains on nights when the wind stops moving. Inside the Ozark Mountains, the land still remembers. The soil there is heavy, and some say if you dig deep enough, you'll still find traces of the family America tried to erase. Because some bloodlines don't die, they just wait to be found. The forgotten discovery began not in the mountains, but in the silence of a dusty archive room, tucked beneath the old state courthouse. It was a place where forgotten files, sealed photographs, and lost testimonies gathered to be swallowed by time. In 2021, a documentary researcher named Claire stumbled across a box labeled only with a fading number. No names, no titles, just the faint smell of mold and decay rising from beneath the lid. She hadn't planned to open it. She was searching for unrelated records about a 1930s land dispute in the Ozarks. But something about that unlabeled box seemed to call to her, as if it wanted to be found. Inside were brittle papers, yellowed with age, and a handful of photographs that had almost turned to dust. But among them lay something that shouldn't have existed at all. A government report marked classified, do not circulate. Its subject line read, Undisclosed Family Case, Ozark Region, 1934. That was the moment the world of the living collided with the world of the buried. The report described a family so deeply hidden within the Ozark Mountains that even census takers avoided the region. It spoke of a patriarch who had built his own small kingdom, a secluded compound of cabins and barns surrounded by thick forest, reachable only by foot. The government had apparently discovered the family by accident after a series of disappearances in nearby towns led search parties into the woods. What they found didn't fit into any category known to the outside world. The report mentioned physiological abnormalities, limited cognitive development, and multi-generational confinement. It used words like incestuous line and severe inbreeding, but between the lines, something darker pulsed, a deliberate choice to erase them from history. Instead of helping, authorities sealed the documents, destroyed maps, and ensured the story vanished. No newspaper ever printed a word about it. Claire was stunned. The photographs were blurred, but the outlines of faces, distorted, unfamiliar, stared back. Some of the figures were barefoot, wearing rags, their expressions neither angry nor afraid, but distant, hollow. One image, however, stood out. It showed a man standing on the porch of a cabin, tall and gaunt, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a hat. Behind him, two young girls stood close together, their features oddly similar, almost mirror-like. The back of the photo was stamped, recovered 1934, restricted evidence. No further explanation. She spent weeks tracing the origins of that file. Every inquiry led to a dead end, records missing, pages blacked out, officials pretending not to know. But then she found one thread, a note from an anthropologist dated 1947, referring to Field Report, Ozark genealogical contamination. It mentioned a family name that had been erased from all public record, replaced with a single letter, W. That letter became her obsession. As she dug deeper, she discovered that even local folklore in the Ozarks avoided speaking of a family by that name. Old residents would grow quiet when asked, pretending not to remember. One elderly man eventually whispered to her, "They weren't supposed to exist, ma'am. They were taken out of the books for a reason." His eyes were glassy when he said it, like someone who had seen things better left unseen. When pressed for more, he simply replied, "The government didn't find them. The mountain did." The further Claire investigated, the clearer it became that this family wasn't just forgotten. They were deliberately erased. Official maps from the 1930s had blank spaces where their property should have been. Geological surveys stopped abruptly at the same coordinates, and police reports from nearby towns referenced missing hikers, hunters, and children who wandered too far into the trees, always near the same unmarked area. Yet every investigation ended with the same phrase: no evidence recovered. It was as if the forest itself was swallowing anyone who got too close. One of the most disturbing findings came from a letter written by a young nurse who had worked with the original investigation team in 1934. Her letter, never sent but preserved among her belongings, described the night they found the family's compound. She wrote of strange chanting coming from the trees and children who didn't speak in words but in sounds, animalistic, rhythmic, echoing. She described the patriarch, a skeletal man who referred to himself as Father of the Pure, and who insisted that his family's isolation was divinely ordered. When authorities tried to remove the children, several resisted violently, biting, scratching, and screaming in a language no one recognized. The nurse ended the letter with a single line: "I can still hear them when I close my eyes." What made the discovery even more terrifying was how intentionally the world turned away. The state records Claire found suggested that after the initial report, the family's existence was deemed non-essential to preserve. Funding for investigation was cut. The remaining members were supposedly relocated, though no records of relocation existed. Instead, the file ended with a recommendation: terminate all related inquiries. The few surviving notes implied that officials believed the genetic damage within the family was too extensive, that rehabilitation or integration into society was medically and ethically futile. It was genocide by silence. Years later, during Claire's field visit to the Ozarks, she met a park ranger who claimed to have found something strange while surveying old trails: rusted tools, bones, fragments of furniture buried beneath layers of dirt. He said the ground in that area never stays quiet. Animals avoided it. Compasses spun in circles. Once, while camping overnight near that ridge, he heard footsteps circling his tent, followed by whispering voices that faded whenever he turned on his flashlight. He refused to go back. Those whispers seemed to follow Claire, too. Locals warned her that the mountain doesn't forget. Some even said descendants of the family still lived hidden in remote cabins, away from civilization, their features softened by time, but their lineage intact. She couldn't prove it, but late one evening, while reviewing drone footage from a forest clearing, she saw movement in the corner of the frame. A figure, pale and motionless, standing behind the trees, watching. When she reversed the clip and zoomed in, the face was blurry, but unmistakably human. Too human. The forgotten discovery wasn't just a historical record, it was a door, and opening it seemed to wake something that had been sleeping for decades. The more she learned, the more she felt the same pull that had drawn the original investigators. the urge to go deeper, to see for herself. But every account she found, every file, every journal, every testimony, ended the same way. With disappearance, with silence, with the mountain reclaiming what was once exposed. And so the story of the Inbred family in the Ozark Mountains began not with their birth, but with their erasure. A family that existed outside time, born of fear and control, hidden by shame, and erased by those sworn to protect truth. The forgotten discovery wasn't just the reopening of a file. It was the reawakening of a secret that had been buried for nearly a century, waiting patiently beneath the trees, whispering in the dark, ready to be found again. Claire's journey into the Ozark Mountains began with little more than coordinates scribbled on a faded map, and the uneasy awareness that she was tracing the path of those who had vanished before her. The deeper she drove into the hills, the less the modern world seemed to exist. The paved roads gave way to gravel, then to dirt, until finally there was no road at all, just a narrow trail winding through endless walls of forest. The air grew colder, heavier, and the silence pressed in on her like a living thing. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of nature. It was a suffocating stillness that seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. She had read about how isolation changes people, how generations cut off from the outside world begin to form their own rules, their own truths. But nothing she had read prepared her for the reality of what she was stepping into. Locals had warned her not to go too far, not to chase stories that didn't want to be found. At the gas station miles back, an old woman had said in a low voice, "There are places in those woods that don't belong to us anymore. The ground remembers who walked it last." Claire laughed it off then, but the words clung to her as she parked the car near a crumbling bridge and began her hike. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snapping of branches, seemed amplified. She could almost feel eyes watching from the tree line, though the forest appeared empty. The deeper she went, the more she noticed strange things. Wooden carvings nailed to trees, small bundles of feathers tied with string, and symbols carved into the bark that resembled a twisted family crest. Each one pointed toward a clearing up ahead, the supposed heart of where the family once lived. When she finally reached it, the forest opened into a small hollow surrounded by steep ridges. In the center stood the remnants of what might have been cabins, collapsed roofs, splintered walls, and stone chimneys overgrown with vines. The place reeked of rot and old rain, as though the earth had been swallowing it for years. Yet among the decay, she noticed something unsettling. Footprints, fresh and small, leading into one of the partially standing cabins. Someone, or something, was still there. She called out softly, but her voice sounded strange in the air, echoing off the ridges like a whisper repeated by unseen mouths. Inside the cabin, time had stopped. Rusted beds, cracked jars, and a rust-colored Bible sat on a wooden table, its pages fused together with moisture. Above the fireplace hung photographs, some blurred, others scratched out entirely. Faces had been deliberately removed, leaving only outlines of heads and shoulders. One image, however, survived, a family portrait of sorts. A tall man in suspenders stood at the center, his eyes unnervingly direct, with two teenage girls on either side of him, their faces eerily similar. Their eyes, though, those eyes didn't look right. Too wide, too glassy, like they were staring through the camera rather than at it. As Claire studied the photo, she noticed markings on the walls, hand-drawn family trees, generations mapped out in looping, uneven handwriting. But unlike any normal family chart, the lines doubled back on themselves, siblings connected to siblings, children born from names that appeared twice. It wasn't a family tree. It was a circle, an unbroken loop of bloodlines that refused to end. A cold wave rippled through her. This wasn't just isolation. It was ritual. It was design. These people hadn't been victims of circumstance. They had chosen their separation, convinced that their purity depended on never letting outsiders taint their lineage. She stepped outside to clear her head, but the forest had grown darker, the light dimming faster than it should. That was when she heard it, a faint melody carried on the wind, like a humming, somewhere between singing and crying. It came from beyond the ridge, rhythmic and slow, almost human, but not quite. She followed the sound, careful with each step, until she came upon an old root cellar partially buried beneath the hill. The door was splintered, hanging loose, and the smell that poured from it made her gag. It was the scent of damp soil mixed with something far older, far more rotten. Inside, the beam from her flashlight caught the edges of jars and bones, fragments of dolls, and what looked like animal skulls arranged in a circle. But it was what lay against the far wall that froze her in place. A wooden cradle, rocking ever so slightly, though there was no wind. Her flashlight flickered, and for an instant she saw the faint outline of a figure crouched beside it, pale skin glimmering like wax before vanishing into the shadows. The cradle stopped moving. The air felt colder, thicker, pressing against her lungs. She stumbled backward, nearly dropping the light, and ran until the sound of the forest blurred into a single pounding heartbeat in her ears. When she finally reached the clearing again, she looked back and saw nothing. No cellar, no movement. Only the heavy stillness of the woods swallowing everything she'd just seen. That night, as she returned to her car, she found her tires slashed, her keys missing from her bag. Someone had been there while she was in the woods. Panic gave way to realization. She was being watched. From the corner of her eye, she caught a faint glow in the trees, a lantern swinging slowly, then another and another. Figures began to emerge from the darkness, silent, expressionless, watching her with the same wide, glassy eyes she'd seen in the photograph. They didn't speak. They didn't move closer. They simply watched, as if studying her the way one studies an animal that wandered too close to the fence. She managed to start the car by hot-wiring it and sped down the dirt road, heart hammering, branches scraping the windows. But even as she escaped the forest, she could still see them in her rearview mirror, shapes standing at the tree line, motionless, as the lights of civilization began to appear in the distance. She didn't stop until she reached the nearest town, where she sat trembling in the parking lot of an old diner, the smell of earth still clinging to her clothes. When she looked at the photographs she'd taken on her phone, something was wrong. The cabins appeared clear, but in every image where she'd been alone, there were shadows, tall, human shapes standing just behind her, their faces blurred as if the mountain itself refused to let them be seen. In the days that followed her escape from the mountains, Claire tried to convince herself that what she had seen was nothing more than exhaustion and fear taking hold of her mind. She had spent the night in her car outside the diner, unable to sleep, jumping at every passing sound. By morning, she decided to return home and document everything, the photographs, the coordinates, the letters. But when she connected her camera to her laptop, something unexplainable had happened. Half of the files were corrupted. The images that had once shown the cabins, the carvings, the strange footprints, now appeared distorted, warped by static and streaks of light as if something inside the photographs was moving, erasing itself. Only one remained intact. The portrait she'd taken of the family tree scratched into the cabin wall. The looping names in the closed circle stood out clearly, untouched by corruption, as though it wanted to be remembered when everything else refused to exist. Claire began reaching out to historians, anthropologists, even a few paranormal researchers, but none of them could explain what she'd found. Some dismissed it as a hoax. Others refused to even look at the evidence once she mentioned the location. One man, an elderly professor from Arkansas, broke his silence after a long pause. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said. "Those people weren't just isolated, they were kept. The mountain doesn't let its secrets go easy." When she pressed him for more, he hung up, leaving her with a quiet click that felt heavier than any warning. Her nights grew restless. The humming she'd heard in the woods began to echo faintly in her dreams. At first it came as a whisper, distant and hollow, but soon it grew louder, clearer, as if it were right outside her window. She tried recording the sounds, hoping to catch something tangible, but every morning when she played back the audio, it was filled with static and a low rumble, like the sound of breathing. Then one night, while reviewing her notes, she noticed something impossible. In the corner of one of her corrupted photographs, a faint face had appeared, pale, expressionless, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at her. The same face from the family portrait in the cabin. The same face that had haunted her dreams. She began to wonder whether the family had truly disappeared at all. Every source she found, every document she uncovered, seemed to imply something different, that after the supposed relocation by the authorities, there were sightings. Farmers in nearby towns reported hearing strange cries in the woods at night. A hunter in 1958 claimed to have stumbled upon a camp of deformed children who fled at the sight of him. And in the early 1970s, a woman hiking alone had vanished near the same region. Her body was never recovered, but her backpack was found months later with pages torn from a local newspaper stuffed inside. Articles about genetic experiments, family purity, and missing census data from the Ozarks. The deeper Claire looked, the clearer it became that the truth wasn't just hidden. It was protected. The few officials still alive from that time either refused to talk or gave contradictory accounts. Some said the family was exterminated to prevent contamination. Others swore they were relocated under new identities, allowed to integrate quietly into society. But none of the records matched. There were no death certificates, no adoption papers, no evidence that any of them had ever truly left the forest. It was as if they had been absorbed back into the land that birthed them, leaving only whispers behind. And yet something about that idea didn't feel right. Claire couldn't shake the sense that someone was still watching her. She began noticing things, small, almost imperceptible details that filled her with dread. Muddy footprints near her porch after rain, a faint smell of damp soil inside her house even though she hadn't opened the windows. Once, while driving home late at night, her headlights caught a figure standing at the edge of the road. It didn't move. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes reflected the light in a way that wasn't human. She blinked, and it was gone, swallowed by darkness. Her friends told her she was overworked, that her obsession had become paranoia. But when she looked through her window one night and saw a small handprint smeared across the glass, smaller than an adult S, yet not quite a child's, she realized it wasn't paranoia at all. The mountain hadn't forgotten her. She had brought something back, something that refused to stay buried. The family might have been erased from history, but history itself had a way of clawing back through the cracks, demanding to be seen. And now, it seemed, that same bloodline she had uncovered was no longer confined to the woods. It had followed her home. By the fourth week, Claire's world had shifted from investigation to survival. Her house, once her refuge, had turned into a place she no longer recognized. The lights flickered without cause, shadows stretched across the walls, even when there was no one there, and the air carried the same heavy stillness she remembered from the Ozark forest. It started with small disturbances, objects moving on their own, doors she knew she'd locked standing ajar in the morning, whispers that came from the corners of rooms when everything else was silent. But the most disturbing sign came one night when she awoke to the faint sound of humming. It was soft at first, barely audible, but the tune was unmistakable. It was the same eerie melody she had heard in the woods, the one that had led her to the buried cellar. Only now, it was coming from somewhere inside her house. She got up slowly, her heart pounding, and followed the sound down the hallway. The humming seemed to move with her, growing louder as she reached her office, the room where she'd been keeping her notes, photographs and recordings. When she pushed the door open, her laptop screen was already on, glowing in the dark. The corrupted photos she had saved earlier were cycling automatically in a slideshow she hadn't started, and with every flicker, faces began to appear in the distortion, first blurred, then clearer. The patriarch's hollow stare, the two identical girls, and behind them, shapes that didn't look fully human, their limbs too long, their mouths slightly open as though mid-song. The humming stopped abruptly. Claire stood frozen, waiting for something to happen, when the screen glitched and displayed a single frame that made her knees weaken. It was a photo of her, standing in front of her car the day she left the mountain. But she hadn't taken that picture. After that night, she stopped sleeping. The noises grew more distinct, footsteps creaking on the floorboards above her, faint laughter echoing through the vents, the sound of breathing when she stood still long enough to listen. She tried to rationalize it, telling herself it was just her mind breaking under stress. But then her neighbors began to notice strange things, too. They found dead animals in their yards, birds, cats, even a deer once, each with its eyes missing, as if something had taken them. One of them mentioned seeing someone standing near Claire's window at night, pale and unmoving. She checked her security cameras, but the footage glitched every night between 2 and 3 a.m., leaving only static. Desperate, Claire reached out to a priest who specialized in cases of hauntings and exorcisms. He agreed to visit her home, though his tone on the phone carried hesitation. When he arrived, he seemed uneasy from the start, commenting on how the air feels wrong before even stepping inside. As he walked through the house, sprinkling holy water and murmuring prayers, the temperature began to drop. His breath became visible. Then the power went out, plunging them into darkness. The priest's candle flickered wildly as the sound of humming returned, low, resonant, circling them like a presence that knew they were intruding. The priest froze, clutching his cross, whispering, "This isn't of the dead. This is of the living." Moments later, the humming stopped again, and the power flicked back on. Without another word, he left, refusing payment, muttering that she had brought something ancient back with her. From that day forward, Claire stopped trying to fight it. The more she resisted, the stronger it became. Her dreams were now filled with images of the mountain. The cabins rebuilt, the patriarch standing in the doorway, the two girls whispering her name. She could feel something calling her back, pulling her toward the place she had disturbed. And in her waking hours, she began to see them, not just in reflections or shadows, but in daylight. Glimpses of faces in passing cars, figures standing on distant hills. It was as though the boundary between the mountain and the rest of the world had cracked open, and she was standing at the fault line, caught between what was hidden and what should have stayed buried. Claire's breaking point came one cold morning when she woke to find her front door wide open, though she knew she had locked it the night before. The air inside was freezing, her breath visible as she stepped cautiously into the living room. Every window was shut, every curtain drawn, yet something felt wrong, an invisible weight pressing down on her chest. On the floor lay muddy footprints, small and bare, leading from the door to her office. Her hands trembled as she followed them, each step heavier than the last. When she reached the office, she froze. The family tree she had photographed in the cabin, the one carved into the wall, was now drawn across her own walls in black ink. The same looping names, the same symbols. But this time, at the very bottom of the circle, a new name had been added in shaky handwriting, her own. She screamed, stumbling backward, knocking over her desk. Papers scattered across the floor, her research spilling like the contents of a grave. The ink on the wall began to drip slowly, as though the lines themselves were bleeding. Claire grabbed her camera to document it, desperate to prove she wasn't losing her mind. But when she raised the lens, the wall was blank again. Every trace of the drawing had vanished, leaving nothing but her own panicked reflection staring back from the dark window. The room felt alive, breathing, as if the house itself was watching her unravel. She fled outside, gasping for air, but even there, the silence felt unnatural. The birds were gone. The wind had stopped. The world around her seemed suspended, like time itself was holding its breath. And then she heard it. The sound of something moving behind her, slow and deliberate. When she turned, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. It was tall and thin, its head tilted slightly to one side, watching her. She couldn't see its face, but the posture was familiar, the same outline she had seen in the old photograph of the patriarch. He didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to paralyze her. She backed into her car and locked the doors, trying to steady her breathing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, faintly, she heard it again. The humming. The same haunting melody, this time coming from inside the car. It was coming from the back seat. She spun around, flashlight in hand, but there was no one there. Only the faint impression of a handprint smeared across the fogged glass, smaller than an adult's but disturbingly human. That was when she realized it wasn't just one presence anymore. It was many. They were everywhere, surrounding her, their whispers overlapping into a single suffocating sound. She started the car and sped down the road without looking back. The trees blurred past her, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she had escaped. But as she looked into the rearview mirror, her heart stopped. Seated in the back seat, just for a second before vanishing, were two identical girls. Their pale faces were expressionless, their eyes black and hollow, their lips moving in unison as if humming a lullaby she could no longer pretend not to hear. Claire didn't stop driving until she reached a small roadside motel several towns away, her mind fractured between disbelief and the need to survive. She booked a room under a false name, too afraid to use her credit card, and locked herself inside, checking the windows twice before sitting in silence. Every creak of the floorboards made her jump. She could still hear the humming faintly in her ears, even though there was no sound around her. It had become part of her, like a tune she couldn't forget no matter how hard she tried. Her hands trembled as she opened her laptop to send her research to an online archive, determined that if anything happened to her, the truth wouldn't die with her. But when she uploaded the files, the progress bar froze midway, flickered, and then erased everything. Every folder she had spent months compiling, every document, every photograph, gone. A message flashed across her screen for only an instant before disappearing. Return what was taken. Panic tightened around her like a noose. She slammed the laptop shut and stared at her reflection in the darkened TV screen. Her eyes looked sunken, her skin pale. But it wasn't just exhaustion. She looked different, altered in a way she couldn't explain. As she reached up to touch her face, she noticed faint bruises forming around her neck, like fingerprints pressing from beneath the skin. Her breath caught in her throat as a thought clawed its way into her mind. What if she was changing? What if whatever cursed blood had lived within that family was now flowing in her too? She had entered their world, disturbed their graves, and now she could feel something binding her to them, pulling her back toward the place she had tried to escape. Later that night she woke to the sound of knocking. Not from the door, but from inside the walls. 3 slow knocks, followed by silence, then 3 more, louder this time. She turned on the lights, her body shaking, and pressed her ear to the wall. The knocks stopped. She stood there for a long time, listening to the hum of the room, until she heard something new. A voice. It was faint, muffled, but clear enough to understand. A child's voice whispering, "We're still here." She stumbled backward, covering her ears, but the whisper grew louder, joined by others, overlapping until it became a chorus of murmurs and cries. The walls seemed to pulse with them, the air thickening with the smell of earth and decay. She grabbed her car keys, but as she turned toward the door, every light in the room flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. When she stepped outside, the world felt wrong again. The parking lot, the trees, even the stars above seemed too still. Her car sat under a flickering light, but as she approached it, she noticed something smeared across the windshield. In the faint glow, she could see handprints, dozens of them, small and overlapping, pressed into the glass as if a crowd had been standing there, watching her sleep. Her breath fogged the air as she stepped closer, and that was when she saw it. Written across the hood in streaks of mud were 3 words, "Come back home." Her heart stopped. She looked around, scanning the empty lot, the distant highway, the trees beyond. There was no one. Yet she could feel them, close, hidden, waiting. She got into her car and locked the doors again, trembling so hard she could barely hold the steering wheel. But when she turned the key, the engine refused to start. She tried again. Nothing. And then, from somewhere deep in the woods behind the motel, the humming began again. This time it wasn't faint or far away. It was all around her, circling, closing in. The mountain wasn't done with her. It was calling her back. The days that followed blurred into a suffocating haze for Claire. Every attempt she made to return to normal life ended in failure, as if the world itself was rejecting her presence. She moved from one small town to another, changing motels, names, and appearances, but the whispers always followed. Sometimes they came through the static of a broken radio, sometimes in the wind against her window, and once in the voice of a child asking from behind her reflection in the mirror, "Why did you leave us?" She stopped sleeping through the nights. Each dream pulled her back to that cabin in the Ozark mountains, where the air smelled of wet soil and decay, and she could see the patriarch sitting in his chair, his cloudy eyes fixed on her, smiling faintly as though he knew she would never escape. Claire began to notice the marks spreading across her body. faint lines and bruises that formed in the shape of hands or strange geometric patterns that pulsed beneath her skin. At first, she thought it was stress or paranoia, but soon the pain became real, physical, as if something alive was trying to crawl its way out. Her reflection no longer matched her reality. Her eyes appeared darker, her cheekbones sharper, her voice lower when she spoke to herself. The bloodline she had uncovered was no longer a story. It was becoming her inheritance. The more she ran, the more she could feel the pull of that cursed lineage, whispering to her from beyond death. One night she found herself driving without remembering how she got into the car. The GPS was turned off, her phone battery dead, yet the road ahead seemed to guide her on its own. The landscape around her grew more familiar. The same trees, the same winding hills, the same eerie silence that had once surrounded the family's land. Panic set in when she saw the wooden sign, half buried in the mud, "Welcome to Carver Hollow." She slammed the brakes, breathing hard, but the car wouldn't stop. It rolled forward slowly, headlights illuminating the broken trail leading deeper into the woods. The humming began again, low and rhythmic, vibrating through the steering wheel. Her eyes filled with tears as she whispered to herself, "I'm not supposed to be here." But the car didn't listen. When she finally stumbled out, the night air hit her like ice. The cabin still stood there, warped and half-collapsed, as if waiting for her return. The door creaked open before she even touched it. Inside, the photographs she had once documented were gone, replaced with new ones. Images of her standing in front of the cabin, her sitting in the motel room, her driving on the empty road. Every moment she thought she had escaped had been watched, recorded. In the corner of the room, the patriarch's chair rocked slowly, even though there was no wind, and on the table, half buried under dust, lay her missing notebook. Her hands shook as she opened it, finding pages she hadn't written, entries in her handwriting describing events that hadn't yet happened. The final page read, "You are one of us now." As she stared at the words, she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, heavy, purposeful. The smell of damp earth filled the air again, and the faint humming grew louder until it was all she could hear. The walls seemed to breathe, the floor pulsing under her feet like a living thing. When she turned, the doorway was filled with shadows that took on human shapes, faces she recognized, faces from her research, from her nightmares. They were no longer buried in the mountains. They were standing before her, smiling through rotting teeth and hollow eyes. And in that final moment before the lights went out, Claire realized the truth. No one ever left the Ozarks. The mountain didn't just hold their blood. It demanded it. When the cabin was finally discovered months later, it was by a group of hikers who had lost their way on the mountain. They claimed the forest had gone unnaturally quiet. No birds, no insects, not even the usual rustling of trees. The air was thick and metallic, heavy with the scent of decay. When they stumbled across the cabin, they said it looked like it had been untouched for decades, though the ground outside was freshly disturbed, as if something or someone had been moving through the soil recently. The hikers reported finding a half-open door, a broken lantern still faintly flickering, and a notebook lying on the floor, pages soaked from the rain. The words inside were barely legible, written in a hurried scrawl that repeated the same sentence over and over. "The mountain remembers." Authorities were called, but by the time they arrived, the hikers' directions led to an empty clearing. There was no cabin, no furniture, not even a trace of the path the group swore they had taken. It was as though the forest had swallowed the structure whole. The officials dismissed the story as a hoax, but one of the rescuers, an older man who had lived in the Ozarks his whole life, refused to go back. He said the place wasn't gone. It was only hidden, like it always had been. Weeks later, one of the hikers went missing. His phone was found deep in the mountains, screen cracked, recording still running. The final moments of the footage showed him breathing heavily, whispering that he heard someone calling his name. Then came the humming, a low, rhythmic vibration that sounded eerily human, followed by a faint voice saying, "You came back." The story spread across online forums and dark history channels, reigniting the legend of the Ozark bloodline. People claim to see strange figures moving through the trees near abandoned trails, always in the corner of their vision, never long enough to capture. A few who ventured too close reported hearing singing in the night. Two female voices, youthful and uneven, harmonizing with an older man's baritone. Locals warned outsiders to stay away, saying the family had finally found peace, and disturbing them would mean becoming part of their curse. Yet curiosity has a way of pulling people toward the forbidden, and new explorers kept going in, hoping to find what others couldn't. None of them found the cabin, but almost all returned changed, some claiming they felt something follow them home. Those who've lived near the mountain all their lives say it's not just a myth. They say the mountain itself feeds on memory, on guilt, on those who try to expose what should have stayed buried. Every generation that digs too deep eventually disappears. And maybe that's how the mountain protects its secret, by erasing the ones who get too close. Whether the patriarch's bloodline ever truly ended or not, no one can say. But the humming, the faint whispers, and the soft singing that echo through the Ozark nights remain unexplained. Some say it's the wind. Others know better. Because when the forest goes silent and the air turns still, it means the mountain is listening again, waiting for the next story to tell. So if you dare to uncover more hidden histories like this, subscribe to our channel for more content like this.